OK, maintenant on va peut-être commencer. Merci, bonjour à tous, merci d'être là. On va essayer
Hello,
de
everybody.
dans cet
Now we're
espace
going to get
très
started and we're
brillant.
going to talk in this
Alors
brilliant
je commencerai
space,
par,
and maybe
me
I'm going
présenter. Je
to
suis,
introduce
Christine Barthe.
myself. I'm
Je suis
Christine
responsable
Barthe,
à la
and
collection
I'm
de photographie du
uh,
musée du Quai
in
Branly
charge at
et
the
on va parler,
Branly
toutes les
Museum
3
photography
avec, ma
section,
collègue
and all
Anabelle Lacour,
together with my
également
Anabelle, my
responsable de
colleague,
collection de photographie au
with
musée du Quai
and the
Branly
other colleague,
et
we're going to
avec,
talk about the
Diva Gujral
Branly
qu'on est très
Museum
heureuse
and
d'avoir
with
pu,
Diva
inviter
Gujral. We are
aujourd'hui,
very
qui
happy
est
to have been
historienne de
able
l'art,
to invite
historienne de la
her
photographie,
because she is a
qui
historian
enseigne
of
à
the
la
art of
London
the
School of
photography,
Economics,
and she teaches at the
l'histoire
schools
de
of economics,
l'impérialisme indien
history
et
of
hem
Indian
et avec qui on
photography,
va travailler
and
sur un
with whom
projet
we've
dont on
been
va vous
working
parler
quite a lot
un
on a
peu plus en
project
détail.
that we're going to talk
Donc,
further in
le projet
detail.
le projet
And the
accompli
project
qui nous
that
réunit
we
ici
are
aujourd'hui,
gathered
c'est,
today for, it
un
is
grand projet sur lequel j'ai
a
commencé à
big
travailler il y a
project on
environ,
which I've
10 ans,
started to be
un
working
projet,
for 10
d'exposition,
years. It's
qui,
an
s'est,
exhibition
complété
project
au fur et à
that
mesure
was
et qui est devenu aussi,
complemented gradually
une
over the years
publication,
and became
sur
a
lequel
publication,
on va
of course,
revenir
on
plus en
which we're going
détail.
to come back all
Notamment
together
Anabelle
in
et
further
Diva vont
details.
nous en dire un peu
Diva and
plus.
Annabelle are going to
Moi,
talk
je
a
voulais
little
vous
bit
donner un peu
further into
des
details, and I
éléments clés
wanted to give you
sur
the
cette
key
exposition
items
qui avait été
regarding
pensée
this
donc,
exhibition that
depuis une
was
dizaine
well
d'années,
thought for
pour
over
être,
10 years
montrée, au
in
Louvre,
order
Abu
to
Dhabi,
be
où elle a
shown
été
at the
montrée
Louvre
en
in Abu
2019.
Dhabi, where
Voilà,
it
je vous
was
montre
shown in
quelques images de ce
2019. And I'm
projet.
going to show you
L'idée,
a few
c'était
images
de
of this
revenir
project. And the
sur les
idea was
débuts
to
de l'histoire de
come
la
back on
photographie
the
et sur le
beginnings of
fait
the
que, on savait
photography
assez peu de
and
choses,
the fact that we
dès qu'on
knew
sortait un
very
petit peu des
little
périmètres
about it.
habituels
And as
de
soon as
l'Europe
we
ou
were
des
outside
États-Unis,
the normal box,
que
the normal
finalement,
perimeter
sur ce qui s'était
data,
passé de
we
façon
knew that
assez
what had
précise
happened
dans le
before,
reste
we
du monde,
didn't
ce qui
know
était
it
quand même,
very well
une grande
precisely
surface
in the
possible.
rest of the
On
world,
avait assez
and it
peu
was a
d'éléments de
big
connaissance
surface.
et
And we had
malgré le
very
fait qu'on
few
avait
items. And
cependant
despite the
des
fact
images
that
et
we
notamment dans
had
la collection du musée du
images
Quai Branly,
within
on
the
avait un
Cabroli
nombre
Museum
d'images,
collection,
assez important.
we had quite
Donc,
a few
l'idée, c'était de
images, but the
revenir
idea in
sur
that
cette
was to
collection
come back
et
on the
puis de
collection
pouvoir rentrer un
and
peu
to be
plus, à
able to
l'intérieur.
go further into details to analyze it.
Désolée, je mets mon minuteur, sinon on va pas
Sorry, I'm
rester
going to
longtemps.
put my timer, otherwise I'm
Donc à
going to
partir
talk too much.
de
And
ce
from
projet,
that,
on a
from this
commencé
project,
des recherches,
we started to do
pour essayer de
searches
voir
some
un peu plus
research in order
largement,
to
à
see at a
partir des
wide
images, mais aussi à
angle how
partir des
the
récits,
images
qu'est-ce qu'on
and the
savait de
stories,
ces
what they
auteurs,
would
qu'est-ce qu'on
tell
savait de
us,
ces
what we
pays,
knew about
qu'est-ce
the
qu'on
authors, the
savait, de
countries,
la
what we
façon dont
knew
on
about the
imaginait,
way
ces
could
pays-là et
imagine these
puis les
countries
confronter
doing
à la
so,
réalité
and
des
how we
images qui
could
nous
face
restaient, aujourd'hui.
reality for the
Donc,
photos
on a
that we are
conçu,
having
ce
today.
projet
So
sur
we
lequel on a
conceived
travaillé,
this
Anabelle et moi,
project, we
pendant
designed it,
assez
Annabelle
longtemps
and
et là, je vous
myself, for
montre
quite a few years,
quelques
and I'm
exemples,
going to show you a few
des
examples
différentes
of
sections de
the different
l'exposition, qu'elles soient,
sections of the
au Louvre Abu
exhibition,
Dhabi,
whether it
ici,
is the
ou bien
Louvre Abu
ici
Dhabi
au musée
here
du
or
Quai
the Louvre
Branly.
Abu Dhabi or
Donc on a
here at the
organisé
Musée
le
Gujral
projet,
and the Louvre Abu
autour
Dhabi.
de
We
différentes
centered
sections,
focus
6
the
si on
project
veut,
on
ou
several
5,
sections, six if I
une
remember
qui
well, of
s'appelait,
which one
«Premières
which was
apparitions»
called the first
et qui nous
apparitions,
montrait des
the
daguerreotypes
first
essentiellement,
appearances, and
un
we
grand
could
nombre de
see
daguerreotypes et d'acteurs différents,
daguerreotype
organisés dans un
work
espace, circulaire qui permettait de
within the
vraiment, se
circular
rendre compte de
space,
ce que
which
c'était
was
la
able to give
magie de
us
ce
the
médium
real
et
magic,
de son
this
effet
medium, this
d'apparition d'images.
support, and
Et vous
how
voyez
the
qu'ici, on a
images could
une
appear. And we
petite
can
image
see
en bas à
here a
droite,
little picture, the
puisque, dès le
right-hand
début de cette
corner, and
section,
right
on
from
a
the
tenu
beginning of this
à pouvoir,
section, we were
évoquer des
able
cas
to
de
see, to
photographes,
evoke
occidentaux et
cases
européens
of
qui
Western
voyageaient,
and
qui avaient
European
cette
photos that
possibilité
were
d'aller faire des
traveling, and
images
we had
assez
that
loin, puis de les ramener en
facility to
Europe.
do
Mais on a
these
aussi,
images
essayé dès le
much
début de
further away and
creuser
bring
la
them back
question
to
de
Europe.
photographes
And
qui
we
étaient
were able
implantés
to ask the
localement,
question about the
assez tôt
photographer that was
dans
settled
différentes régions, comme
very
ici,
early in different
notamment
regions,
un
like here.
photographe colombien qui
We've
s'appelle
got
Luis
a
Garcia
Colombian, Luis
et qui a
Garcia
été un des premiers
photographer, Colombian
praticiens de la
photographer, was
photographie.
one of the first
Je vais avancer un petit
practitioner
peu
in the art of
dans les
photography. I'm
images.
going to
La
go a
question
little bit further.
de
And
la
the questions
circulation
regarding
des images
the
a aussi été
dissemination of
quelque
the
chose qui nous a
pictures, it was
beaucoup préoccupés
something
parce qu'on
that
avait parlé des
preoccupied
images
us, worried
terrestres, mais
us a
aussi
lot,
des
because we can
trajectoires
talk
qu'elles avaient
about the remainder of
effectuées,
the
de la
pictures and the
façon dont cette
trajectories of these
culture
images,
visuelle
and how the
s'était
visual culture
disséminée, mais
was
construite aussi à
disseminated
travers
and
différents cas.
was
Donc on a
constructed in
travaillé
several
aussi
cases, and
longtemps
we
sur
worked
une
for
carte
quite a while
interactive qui nous
on
permettait de parler de la
interactive map
façon dont la
in order to
photographie
talk
a
about the way the
petit à petit, mais
photography was
assez
made
vite aussi,
gradually and how it was done,
recouvert totalement
conceived, how it
la surface
covered
du
the
globe.
whole globe, the entire world.
Donc ici,
So
une vue de
here
l'exposition
today you've
de
got a
Paris où
view
on
of
voyait
the
donc ces
Paris
photographes
exhibition
plutôt
where you
européens.
can
Et ici,
see
une
these
image de
European
William Ellis,
photographies.
qui a travaillé à
William
Madagascar
Ellis
à la
here
fin
was
dans
working in
les années
Madagascar
1850
in
et
the
jusqu'à la moitié des années
1850s
1960,
up
avec
to
cette partie
1960s
importante
with
consacrée
this
à des
important part
photographes qui
focused
n'étaient pas
on
tous des photographes, mais qui
photographies
étaient des
that were
professionnels,
not uh,
soit du voyage, soit de
they were not
l'exploration,
necessarily
et qui
photographers,
travaillaient
professional
tous avec
photographers, but they were
peut-être des
working on
propos
the
différents, mais dans le
exploration of the
cadre
different
global
worlds. They
de
were
la large
working
expansion
globally
coloniale
in the big
européenne.
colonial European expansion.
Donc ici des
And
exemples
here
de
we
ces
can see a
images
few
réalisées
examples of
assez
these
tôt, ici
pictures
comme au
taken very
Gabon dans les
early,
années
like here in
1860, donc
Gabon in
des
the
images de notables
1860s.
souvent.
Yes.
Et puis aussi une
And here
partie
you
qu'on a
can
pu
see a
développer un
part
peu
we
plus
were able
largement
to develop
dans la
print
nouvelle édition, dans
in the
l'exposition
new
parisienne,
publication,
qui
the
était
new
cet
edition that
espace
was in
qu'on a
the
appelé
Paris
Histoire locale et
publication,
images de
with
soi, et qui était
local
dédié aux
history and real
pratiques de
images that
photographie en
were
dehors de
made
l'Europe,
for the
et
practice of
faites là
pictures
vraiment
outside Europe. And
localement
here
par
we could
différents
see
photographes pour
locally the
différents propos.
pictures taken
Donc ici, vous
locally
avez
by the
ces
local
deux images
people,
sur
and
la
here
droite
you can
qui
see these
montrent
two
des
pictures
images réalisées
on
par
the
un
right, which
photographe
were pictures
malgache
taken
qui s'appelle
by a
Casa. C'est une
local
image,
Madagascar
notamment celle qui est en haut à droite,
photographer,
qu'on a utilisée
Madagascar, and the one
pour
that we use at the top
l'affiche de
right-hand
l'exposition, mais
side that
aussi pour
was
la
used for
couverture
the
du livre
exhibition and for the
qu'on a
cover of
pu
the book
réaliser à la
that
sortie
we were able
de
to
l'exposition
print
parisienne.
at the end
Puisqu'on
at
avait
the
cherché
Paris
tous ces cas
exhibition
de
because we're
différents
trying to see all
auteurs qui
these
étaient
cases
soit des
of
photographes
different
commerciaux,
authors who were either
soit
photographers
d'autres types
or
de
other
représentants de
types of
ces premières pratiques de
representations of
photographie.
the
Et
first
dans le cas de
practice of
Razav, tout d'un coup,
photography.
on est
But in
tombé
the case of
sur cette
Rata,
image dans
we
un
were
lot
able to
d'images
see
qu'on
these
avait pu
pictures
acheter,
within a lot
et
of
on était
pictures that we're able
très
to
contents de
buy, and
pouvoir
we were very
montrer ces
happy
images où on voit
to
clairement des
show
gens
these
qui peuvent
pictures, and we can
contrôler
clearly see
leur propre
people
image,
who
qui peuvent
are
présenter une image
taking their own
assez,
pictures, and
assez
we can see
satisfaisante d'eux-mêmes,
pictures
assez
which are
heureuse.
very
Et quand on a
satisfactory,
vu
very
que
happy pictures.
dans cette image,
And
il y
we
avait
could
cette
see
femme
in
qui
these
tenait une
pictures there was
photographie
that
et qu'ils
woman who
étaient tous les
was
trois réunis
holding
autour
a
d'un
photo,
album
and they were all
photographique, on s'est dit
together
ça c'est
gathered
le cas
around
parfait
an
pour parler
photography
de cette
album,
partie-là de
photography book, and
l'exposition
we
qui nous
were
intéresse
able to talk
beaucoup.
about that part of
Parce
the
que c'est vrai que dans
exhibition,
les
which
histoires,
interested us a lot because it's true
les histoires
through
larges de
the
la photographie qu'on
personal
connaît, on a pu
histories of
avoir
the
des
various
histoires
people, we were able to
nationales, des
have
histoires
some
locales, des
national
histoires
histories,
continentales peut-être
local
de la
histories,
photographie.
continental
Mais
histories of
finalement,
the
on avait
photography
jamais eu
art,
une histoire
but we never had
plus globale que
before
ça,
a global,
où on pouvait faire
worldwide
des
history
comparaisons
where
entre
we were
pays,
able
entre
to do
régions.
comparisons between
Et c'est
regions and
vrai que
countries. And
on
it
en
is true
connaissait
that
depuis
we
l'Europe et
knew
depuis la
a
France,
little bit
était
from Europe
beaucoup
and from France, but
une
it
pratique
was
hégémonique
very
des
much
photographes
of
européens.
a
Et donc
same
le fait de
practice
pouvoir
everywhere. And the
témoigner en images
fact we
aussi
were able
de
to
cette pratique-là
witness
très tôt,
these
notamment à
practices
Madagascar,
very
mais aussi dans
early,
d'autres parties du
particularly in
monde,
Madagascar and
était
other parts
une
of the
motivation
world, it was a
assez
real
importante pour nous,
motivation for
de pouvoir
us
montrer
to
que
carry on and
localement,
to
il y avait
show
eu
that
des
locally
portraits
we were able to have local
qui étaient
portraits
subis, qui étaient non
that
choisis,
were
mais qu'il
done,
y avait
and
eu
they were not
aussi
necessarily
très
well
vite
chosen,
des
but they were
pratiques
done very
d'appropriation
quickly, and we
et
had
des
appropriation
utilisations
practices very early on
conscientes
set,
et très
and we were
contrôlées
fully
de
knowledgeable
ces
about that,
images.
but they were very controlled,
Donc
these
on va
pictures, early on.
avancer un petit peu.
And we go a little bit
Je vais
further,
passer
and
la
here
parole
I'm going
à
to give the
Anabelle. Donc
floor
cette image
to
dont je viens de vous
Anabelle
parler,
for the
elle
picture
revient
that
en
I was
couverture
talking
du
about,
livre.
and that's the picture used
L'exposition,
for
elle a
the
eu lieu
cover of the
donc dans
book,
deux
and the
endroits différents,
exhibition was done in
d'une
two
part à Abu
places,
Dhabi, d'autre part à
one
Paris. On a
part
fait
the
deux
Louvre in Abu
publications
Dhabi,
différentes.
Cabrol in
Et c'est vrai
Paris.
que
We
le
did
temps
two
qui a passé entre
publications at
ces
the same time, at the time
occurrences
between the
d'exposition nous
two
a permis de vraiment
operations, the two
creuser
occurrences
plus en avant
enabled us
beaucoup
to
de
go
thématiques qu'on
further
avait
into
essayé
more
d'esquisser
details and to
dès
see
la
the
première
themes
version.
that
Et,
were
et le
chosen right
fait
from the
d'être
beginning, from
toutes les
the first version, and to be
deux
all
femmes
together,
françaises
to be
travaillant sur
two
une
French
collection
women
française qui parlait du
working on
monde
the French
entier,
collection that
ça
was
nous a
talking about the
beaucoup
entire
motivé à
world. We were
réfléchir sur
very
le
much
type de publication
motivated in
qu'on
terms of
pourrait faire
thinking
pour
about the
cette
type of
deuxième
publication that we
édition.
were able
Donc
to
je vais
do for
laisser
the
Annabelle
second
vous
edition.
expliquer
And now I'm
comment on a
going to give the
conçu
floor
le
to
projet du
Annabelle,
livre
who's
lui-même.
going to talk to you about the design, the way we
Donc,
did the book. Annabelle
effectivement,
says yes,
lorsque
effectively.
l'exposition
When we
a
did
été
the
programmée à
exhibition
Paris,
and it
on
was
a
planned in
fait
Paris, married, we
il faut
quickly
absolument
said
qu'on
to
fasse,
ourselves, "We need
une
to do
publication,
quickly a
plus
publication,
conséquente, qui
more
dépasse un peu
important
le projet
publication that goes a
du
little bit
catalogue
further
d'exposition,
than the
qui
perimeter
voilà,
that
qui
was
aurait
designed
sa vie propre,
originally,
avec un
um,
titre qui est
in order
différent,
to
donc
have a
monde
proper
photographique,
title, but
histoire
The
des
World
débuts,
of Photography, the beginnings of photography,
et voilà, qui serait
and
plus large et qui aurait
something
une
that
vie,
would be at a
après
wider
l'exposition.
scale after the
Donc
exhibition.
le
So
projet a
the
été, de
project was
réunir des auteurs,
to
chercheurs,
gather
historiens du monde
different
entier dont
authors,
on connaissait,
historians of the
les
entire
travaux
world that we
fondamentaux
knew
du
of,
et de nos recherches
from their
depuis,
works and to
de
do the work
nombreuses
from our
années et dont on a
research.
souhaité,
We've been doing for quite a
réunir.
few years, and
Effectivement,
we
mais
wanted to
voilà, cette
gather all these
polyphonie,
important
elle était
people,
d'autant
to have
plus
several
importante qu'on était,
voices,
deux commissaires françaises
to
qui
be able
partaient, et
to
parlaient,
start with two French
à
women who were
partir,
talking
d'une
about the
collection,
themes, about the collection,
française issue
a
même
French
d'un
collection
héritage,
by itself,
complexe, lié,
heritage from a
à l'histoire,
complex colonial
coloniale, à ses
heritage,
connexions,
and to
mondiales.
have the
Donc on
different
a assez
world
rapidement
connections. But
pu
very
dresser une
quickly,
liste
we were
d'auteurs et
able
on
to
a
make a
aussi,
list of the authors,
été
and
donc,
we
très,
were very much
enfin voilà, on a dressé une liste d'auteurs et
we
on a eu
very much made
reçu
a
des
list, and
retours,
we received quite a good
positifs et
feedback
enthousiastes assez
in this
rapidement, comme la
respect. A
grande
lot of people
majorité,
were very
ce qui
happy to
nous
do so,
montrait aussi
to
qu'il y
take
avait,
part
une
in it, and it
attente et
showed
un
us
souhait
that
de
there was some
participer, à ce
expectancy of the
projet.
people to take part
Donc
in this
l'idée,
project. And
c'était
so the idea was
de multiplier,
to
ces points de vue.
multiply
Donc avec,
the
on
different
a
points of
réuni,
view,
48
to have
auteurs des
several
5
points of view.
continents.
We had
Donc
45,
l'idée,
48
c'était de
people
ne
from
pas
the
avoir
five
cette,
continents.
liste,
The idea was not to have a
d'essais séparés, mais de
restricted
vraiment
list, but
connecter,
really to
croiser, ces
connect,
histoires, celles-ci,
to
ces
cross
objets,
several
pour
histories all
établir aussi,
together in order to
des
be able
liens
to
et voir
establish
comment pouvaient se
links,
dessiner,
to see how
des
we could
phénomènes
draw up
communs de
the
ces débuts
different
de la
phenomena
photographie, au contraire,
regarding the
des
beginnings of the
histoires, des
photography, to
phénomènes
see
qui
the
seraient,
histories,
propres à
to see the
certaines,
phenomena that
régions,
would
à
be proper to
certains
some
pays.
regions,
Donc
to
c'est un
some
volume qui
countries
fait,
in terms of
400
practice. So
pages,
it was a volume
qu'on
of
a
400
construit, en 2
pages that were
chapitres.
built up
Le premier
in two
chapitre, donc,
chapters. The first chapter
trajectoire de la
was
photographie,
trajectory of
géographie des
the
images, qui
photography,
revient,
geography of
sur ces idées
pictures, and we
de
come back on the
circulation à la
ideas of
fois, des
dissemination
savoirs, des
of
images,
the
des
know-how,
photographes,
the
des
pictures, of the
sujets,
author's
eux-mêmes
work,
et des
of the
objets.
subject
Et
being
donc ça s'est
taken as
manifesté plutôt,
photographs, and
transversaux,
also
transgéographiques,
to
avec
do a
une
cross-section of
introduction très
it, and
introductive
to do
de
an
Geoffrey Babchen, qui
introduction
revient
with an
aussi peut-être
introduction of
sur cette
John
question,
Sebastian, who comes back on
donc,
the very questions
passionnante,
of
et
very interesting questions
et
of
brûlante des origines
burning
multiples,
questions about the
de
multiple
la
origins
photographie, et
of
qui
the
montre
world of
aussi la
photography that
concomitance des
shows
mêmes
us
genres photographiques à
concomitantly
travers,
the
le
different
monde dans
photography
les tout
through the
premiers,
world at
mois
the
et
very
premières
early
années, de la
stages of
photographie.
the world of
Et donc
photography.
ensuite
And
un
then
2e,
after that, we were
chapitre,
able to see a
donc avec,
second
beaucoup
chapter of
plus
the
de
book
textes,
with
où
more
là qui
text,
suit, un
more
découpage
narrative
géographique. Il
to
nous a semblé,
recoup
vraiment
the
nécessaire à un
geographic
moment donné de revenir
location,
à ce découpage, à cette
to
segmentation
see that
géographique,
different
aussi pour s'intéresser
segmentation per
plus en détail
territory
justement
in order to see further
sur ces
into
histoires locales,
details
ces
the
ancrages,
local
régionaux,
histories, the regional
de la
histories
photographie.
of the
Et
world of
on a également
photography.
essayé
And
de
equally,
varier,
we
les
try to
formats,
bet on different
et les
formats,
échelles
to
au
do
niveau
it at
des textes,
different
avec,
scales
voilà
regarding the
des
narrative,
essais,
to have
plutôt,
different essays, different
donc de grandes
dissertations in
synthèses
order
plutôt
to go
régionales,
to
ou,
see big
transcontinentales,
recaps of
et puis,
transcontinental
des
and
textes qui
regional
sont plus des
summaries, texts that
micro-histoires
were
sur, un
more a
photographe
kind
ou
of
une ville,
micro
ou des cas
histories on the
d'études,
photographer,
plus
on the
précis,
town,
sur un
and to have
corpus,
more
ou sur,
precise
un album.
themes within the
On va donner
corpus of
quelques exemples
various
pour rentrer un
topics.
peu
We're
plus,
going to
en
give you
détail
a
dans
few
le contenu,
topics, a few
avant de
examples
laisser,
in order to see further into
la parole,
details. Different
à
take
Diva
people giving the
Gujral.
floor to Diva
Donc
Gujral,
on a
who's going to talk later on
récemment,
about
le
it.
texte
And
de Diva
we can
Gujral qui
see the
revenait,
text and the
vraiment sur,
narrative of
un
Diva
éclairage sur,
Gujral that came
deux
back on
photographes,
putting a
de
lighting
Bombay,
on some
dont on
Bombay
connaissait les noms
photographies,
dans
Mumbai
l'historiographie, mais dont il n'y
photographies
avait
in
pas
the world
eu,
of
vraiment de
history,
recherche qui étaient connus
because
comme
we
étant
didn't have
les
any
premiers
research
photographes
done
indiens. Mais
regarding
donc
the first
Diva
two Indian
revient vraiment
photographers, but
sur leur
Diva
parcours.
is talking about their
Donc des
history.
images étaient aussi présentées
The
dans
images
l'exposition, et
were
c'est aussi la
presented,
question
were
des
shown in
témoignages, de
the
qu'est-ce qui reste pour
history
raconter
as
ces
well,
histoires. Et
and what
ici, on a
comes
pu,
from the
faire
history.
l'acquisition l'année
Here we
dernière
can
d'un
see the
ensemble de
exhibition
cartes,
last
de
year, these
visite,
pictures
de l'un
for
de ces
the
photographes,
business card
Richard
for one of the
Chintaman, qui
photographers,
était montré
Richard
dans
Chintaman,
l'exposition.
Chintaman,
Un texte
that
très
was shown in
important,
the exhibition. So
sur
it's a
l'histoire de la
very important
photographie
narrative
iranienne,
on the history of
à
the
l'époque
Iran
Qajar, par
photography, Alex
Mohamed
Galjar,
Reza
that was
Tamatspour, qui est
done from
un
Mohammad
grand
Reza
historien de la
Tamatsour,
photographie,
who's a big
de cette
Iranian
époque-là, qui a écrit
historian about
les travaux
the art of
fondateurs et finalement
photography,
assez
and
peu connu
who
alors que
made
l'Iran est un
the
grand
fundamental
pays
work because
de la
Iran is a
photographie
big
dès ses débuts
country, very
et notamment
important
connaît un essor
in the world, in the
vraiment
art of
très important
photography,
sous
right from the
l'impulsion
beginning and from the
Nasser al-Din
impulse
Shah,
of
donc le Shah
Nasser
d'Iran,
al-Din Shah,
donc
the
un
Iran
important
Shah,
mécénat
who
royal
was a very
iranien de la
important
photographie, a
sponsor
créé un
of
atelier
the
au sein
world of
de
photography, that
Lacour de
made a
photographie, a
workshop
nommé des
within the
photographes,
World Court,
fait
and he
importer du
nominated
matériel
a
et a
few
constitué une
photographers, he
collection
imported
royale très
material, and he
importante de
started a
photographie.
very
C'était
important
un
royal
des sujets
collection right
aussi
from
de
the beginning by the
l'exposition
Shah of
et
Iran. It
un
was
des
one of the
articles,
themes of the
c'est cette
exhibition,
question
one of the
du
items
mécénat
regarding the
et
question
de
of
grandes figures
sponsorship and the big
régnantes qui ont
figures
pu
that played a
favoriser
big
cet
role
essor
within the world of
local et
photography and
précoce
with the
de la
local
photographie dans différentes régions du
history
monde,
that
notamment
was made in the
sur le
different
continent
regions of the world,
asiatique.
namely on the Asian
Donc là, un
continent.
portrait de Nasser
So
al-Din Shah
here
qui
we
provient
see a
d'un
portrait
album
of
du musée
Nasser
Guimet qui est
Shah that comes
représenté
from an album that
dans
was presented
l'exposition.
to us within the
Et puis
exhibition.
cette
And
photographie
here
qui
we can
montre
see this
l'atelier de
photograph that
photographie
shows the
au
workshop
sein de l'école
within
polytechnique d'Iran.
the polytechnical school of Iran.
Un texte aussi
And
là
here's a
ici à
text
quatre mains
that was
d'Edouard de
done by
Saint-Tour, c'est
Katma
Jacqueline
and Edouard
Nguyen
Santour and Jacqueline
qui est
Nguyen.
intéressant parce
That
qu'il
was,
croise
is
aussi
very
les
interesting
sources
because it
avec, de par
crosses
leur
the
domaine de recherche
sources and
spécifique,
checks
va
them with the
croiser à la fois
different
des sources
specific
en
areas
France et au
of
Vietnam,
research
donc il donne un
in France
panorama un peu
and
plus
in
complet
Vietnam in order to
de
have a
cette
full
histoire de la
panorama of the
photographie
full
au Vietnam.
history of photography,
Donc,
the art of photography in Vietnam.
on a mis des
And
exemples
here
pour
we
montrer un
put
peu
a
la
few examples
diversité,
in order
à la
to
fois
show you the
géographique et
diversity
des
of
sujets qui sont
photography and
traités.
the
Voilà,
diversity of the different subjects that were
je
processed.
t'invite à
So
feuilleter, mais
we
voilà, on va
invite
trouver
you
aussi
to
un texte
peruse the book,
vraiment
to
intéressant
see the
aussi par
book,
sa
to see some texts
son
which are very
positionnement
interesting,
dans le
depending on the
contemporain,
positioning
qui
of
est
the
autour de la question
contemporary
de la circulation
art and
contemporaine des
the
images de populations
dissemination of
autochtones
the
en
pictures through
Australie
the
et la
local
manière dont ces
Australian
photographies, quand
population
bien
and the
même
way these photos
elles
were
sont issues d'un
taken
contexte
and how they were
de
made
colonisation
within a
violente,
context of
constituent
violent
aujourd'hui
colonization,
un patrimoine
the,
important pour
a
les
history,
communautés
a legacy for
autochtones.
the
Et
local
donc
Aboriginal
l'auteur revient sur
communities,
notamment
and
des
the author
projets
comes back on
numériques
the
de
various
partage
digital
de ce
projects that
patrimoine.
were done for sharing this
Donc,
legacy.
à la fois dans
So here,
l'exposition et dans le
at the
livre, on a
same
aussi
time
voulu
within
montrer
the
la
exhibition and
complexité
within the book,
des
wanted to show
situations
you
et
the
la grande
complexity, the
diversité
various
des pratiques
situation,
photographiques,
and the
et
big
notamment sur la
diversity of the
question
practice of
de
the art of
lorsqu'on
photography
s'intéresse
very
aux
early on.
pratiques
And
locales de la
when
photographie,
we wanted
toujours
to
voilà,
see the
resituer
local
dans un contexte
practices,
et ne
we want to
pas
put it within the
essentialiser, ne
context.
pas simplifier et polariser
We
avec des
cannot
pratiques homogènes, mais mieux comprendre
oversimplify with
cet
European
écosystème et
practice, but
comment
we
tout
need to
ça se
understand
passe.
this ecosystem,
Ici,
how it's
c'est le
happening.
photographe
And
japonais
here,
Yamamoto
for
Kenzo qui a
example,
fait
Tamata Kanzo,
les
Japanese
premières photographies sur
photographer,
l'île de
took the first
Kaïdo avec
photographs of the
des populations
Hokkaido
autochtones
island about the local
Aïnous,
populations,
qui
the
montre aussi
Ainu
cet usage
population, which
de la
shows as
photographie
well the use
avec
of
une dimension
photography that with
ethnographique
the
et dans un
ethno
contexte colonial au
dimension within
Japon.
the
Il y a un
colonial
très bel
context in
ensemble
Japan
de
for the
photographies qui étaient
Ainu
aussi représentées dans
minority that
l'exposition.
was represented within the exhibition.
Un autre exemple d'un
Another
photographe
example that
javanais,
you can see is a
Kassen
Japanese
Septas, donc
photographer, Kansan
un texte, on a un
Sepasta,
texte d'Alexandre
with
Sabatonio qui
the
revient sur ce
text
parcours
from
aussi d'une
Alexander that
figure
came
très
back
intéressante
on
où on
the
voit
very
la
important
manière dont
author
ces
as well,
photographes
because we can
professionnels
see how
commerciaux ont
these
pu s'adapter
professional and
à leur
commercial
clientèle et
photographers were
à
able
la
to adapt
fois
to the local
auprès de
clientele and in
l'élite
order to
locale,
be
mais
able to
aussi
see through the local
du
elite
gouvernement
how,
colonial, en
and
l'occurrence
with the
ici
colonial
néerlandais,
government here,
avec
the Dutch government in
une
Indonesia, how they
documentation
were able
sur
to
les sites archéologiques javanais.
document the
Euh,
Japanese history.
Pour finir, peut-être avant
And in
de
order to
te
finish, maybe
redonner la parole,
before giving the floor back,
un aspect qui était traité
an
aussi dans
aspect that was
l'exposition
dealt with
et
within the
dans
exhibition,
l'ouvrage,
which
qui est la
which the
question
work
des
was
formes d'hybridation
a kind of
de la
hybrid
photographie à
work
d'autres
in the art of
médiums ou
photography with
matériaux
different
qui
supports
sont des
that was
pratiques peut-être
made,
voilà,
practices that
plus
were
vernaculaires,
maybe more vernacular in a
dans le
way.
cas
And here we
de
can
photographie peinte
see
en
the
Inde, donc
painted
qui a connu
photos in
vraiment
India
une
that
pratique très, très importante
was
dès le
a very
19e et tout au long
important
du 20e
practice
siècle.
right from the 19th
Les
century up to
studios
the 20th
en Inde
century with the
proposaient des
local
services
artworks,
de
Indian local
colorisation et
artwork,
donc
which were
voilà, c'est important de
coloring
montrer
that. And it's very
ces pratiques
important that
aussi
kind
qui
of
permettent
different
d'établir des
hybrid
liens
practices, which kind
entre
of
cette
establish a link
technologie moderne
between
européenne et
the
puis des
modern European
traditions
technology
visuelles
and
locales
the
qui
local
préexistaient à
visual
l'arrivée de
and
la
local
photographie.
traditions in
Donc
the
là,
art of
un autre
photography. So
ensemble de
here
photographies
we've
peintes,
got another set of
plutôt
painted
un peu plus tardives,
photographies, a
qu'on peut
little
voir
bit
actuellement
later on, where
exposées au musée.
we could see
Le
them
cas
exhibited
des
at the
embotypes
museum.
japonais aussi,
The
qui est vraiment
case of the
un
Japanese
usage
artwork
voilà,
as
une
well
pratique
for the use and practice
proposée par
here
des studios
that was
japonais
made by the
à
Matsumoto
pour une
Studios
clientèle
for a
exclusivement
clientele,
japonaise, photographie sur verre,
exclusively
dans
Japanese.
dans ces
Within
boîtiers en
that
bois brut de
support,
palomnier
within the little
avec des
box,
inscriptions.
we can see
Voilà,
what is written on
ce
the
type
box,
d'objet.
and
Pour
we can
finir,
see this
un
type of
cas assez
item. And to
inédit de
finish, something
photographie
totally novel in the art
rehaussée
of
de plumes, donc qui
photography
montre une
that was
association
done,
au
an
Mexique
association
de
in
la
Mexico
photographie
with the
avec l'art
photography that
bien
was
connu de
done
la
with the
plumasserie
art
au Mexique.
to do it like
Donc,
that
je
in
te redonne
Mexico.
la parole pour
And
parler
then give you the floor back
d'autres exemples
to
de
talk
ce
about
livre avant
other examples
de laisser
before
la parole à Diva.
giving the
Oui,
floor to
merci.
Diva. Thank you very
Donc,
much. Yes, so
oui,
yes,
voilà
of course,
quelques
here
exemples pour
we
vous
can
donner une
see a
idée de
few
l'ampleur
examples to give you the
des cas
amplitude
différents qu'on a
of
essayé
the
de
different
couvrir.
cases that
Et
we're
donc, on
having
a pu
here. It is
repartir
true, Christine, that we
depuis
can
la collection
start
du musée, qui était une
from
collection
the
extrêmement
collection
riche au
at the
départ. Et
museum,
comme je l'ai
which
dit,
was very rich
l'avantage
right from the
d'avoir pu
beginning, but
travailler vraiment
the
sur
advantage to be
une durée assez
working on
longue pour cette
the
exposition,
very
ça
long
nous a permis
exhibition. It
entre-temps
allowed us
de
to
chercher de
be
façon
able to do some
très
searches,
précise
to do some
des nouveaux cas de
research,
figure qu'on
to
pouvait
be
faire
very
rentrer dans la
precise on the
collection.
new cases that we
Et
could
donc, même si on a
incorporate
pu
within the
bénéficier
collection, even if we could benefit
des
from
suggestions de
the
marchands
various
avisés, que je
suggestions that were
remercie,
made from
pour certains
very
achats, notamment
knowledgeable
sur des achats
purchasers.
en
Thank
Amérique
you very
latine.
much,
On a pu,
particularly for what we
par
bought
ailleurs,
in
localiser un
Latin
ensemble vraiment
America, and we
important
were able to
qui était
geolocalize a very important set
collectionné,
as
rassemblé
well.
par
That
un
collection that was
collectionneur
made
britannique
by
autour
a
des
British
pratiques
collector
des
through the various
photographes
practices of the
africains
early
sur l'ouest de
African
l'Afrique au XIXe
photographers
siècle.
on the Western
Et donc,
Africa. And
ce
of
collectionneur qui s'appelle
course, this
Michael Graham Stewart
collector,
avait
Michael
rassemblé
and Stewart,
plusieurs
he
centaines
managed to
d'images,
gather about 100
notamment
images,
celles de Francis Joac qu'on
namely
voit
the ones of
reproduites
Francis
ici sur
Joac that we can
la
see
page de gauche. Vous
reproduced
avez
here
ce
on
bel
the left.
autoportrait de
You've
ce
got a
personnage très
self-portrait
important
of this
qui
very
a
important
sémé sur toute
person
la
who
côte de
used to
l'Afrique à partir des années
be very
1870
important on the
et qui avait
western
eu vraiment
part of
une
Africa, on
pratique
the coast, who had a very early on
très riche et
practice,
avec
a
beaucoup de
very
succès.
rich
Il a
practice
travaillé comme photographe
in the art of
commercial, il a très bien vendu
photography.
ses
He
images,
was
il
a
s'est
commercial
adapté à la
photographer. He
demande,
was
il a
able to
travaillé
adapt to the
par moments
demand
pour les
of the
colonisateurs aussi.
photographies,
Il a
to the
aussi
demand of the
vendu sa
colonizers.
propre
He was
production.
able to
Donc
sell
des
its own
personnages comme
production.
ça, moi
Very
j'étais très
important
intéressée de
people, and
pouvoir
I was
les
very
mettre en avant.
interested
Mais on
to
avait
put
cette question
them
de
at the
comment en
forefront.
parler dans
To
une
we have the
exposition si on n'a pas
question
le
and
matériau,
how we
si on n'a
can
pas les
talk
images, si on
within
n'a pas
an
les tirages à
exhibition if we
présenter.
haven't got the
Donc on a
prints, the
pu faire
material, the
l'acquisition
images, and the set.
vraiment assez
So we were
récemment de
able
cet
to make
ensemble
the
très conséquent
purchase at this
grâce
set,
à la
very
recherche de ce
important set,
collectionneur et
thanks
ça
to
nous a
the
permis de
research made
construire
by this
un mur
collector.
entier dans
And it
l'exposition
allowed
dédié à
us to have a
plusieurs
full
exemples
wall
de ce photographe
dedicated to these
ouest-africain qui
examples
était
of West
vraiment très
African
important. Et je sais quand on a
photos.
fait les
And
visites
we
dans
were
l'exposition,
able,
je me suis
when we did a few visits
trouvée
within
souvent
the
à expliquer que
exhibition, often I had to
ça nous
explain that
permettait
this
de
allowed
rappeler
us
que ces
to
photographes
show and
ouest-africains
to
étaient à
remind
l'époque
that these
beaucoup plus
West
nombreux que les
African
photographes européens qui
photographers
avaient
were
pu,
more
par ailleurs,
numerous
passer
than
par
the
là et
European
faire des images,
photographers.
et qu'on en avait
And
une vision
we
depuis
had a
ici
different
très
vision at
tronquée
the
parce que
beginning, and
effectivement
we had a
leurs
truncated
images n'avaient pas
vision in
été
a way
ramenées,
because
leurs
their
images n'avaient pas
pictures
été
was not
conservées, elles
brought
n'étaient pas dans les
forward.
collections.
They were
Donc
not kept within the
cette
collection. So
acquisition
this
assez importante,
acquisition
ça nous a
was
permis
very
aussi
important, and we were able to
rééquilibrer les
see
choses
to
Évidemment, encore
balance
plus, la production des
everything and to
photographes
see
européens parce
after
que c'est ce sont
the
ces images-là qui ont
production,
été
because
ramenées.
we were able
Mais
to
c'est
see the
important aussi de
pictures that
pouvoir
we brought
témoigner
back,
aujourd'hui
and
de
we were
cette
able to
activité et de
witness
faire
today from
reconnaître
this
ces filles.
activity
Et
and to
Francis Joag, c'est
recognize
un
it. And
personnage
Francis
absolument
Chouag was
fascinant,
someone who was very
qui
fascinating of
mérite
course,
vraiment qu'on s'attarde
because
sur
we
lui.
need to
Donc
talk about
on
him
a
and
fait
we
appel
need to
à ce chercheur,
call on
suisse,
this
Jörg Schneider, qui
researcher,
a beaucoup à
Jörg
travaillé
Schneider, who
sur
worked
la
very
photographie en Afrique
heavily
de
on
l'Ouest et il
the
appelle,
South
ce
African
concept
photography. And
de
he talked
paysage
about the
atlantique
concept of
visuel
the Atlantic
entre l'Amérique,
visual
l'Afrique et
uh,
l'Europe et comment
landscape between
cette
Africa and
trajectoire des
Europe, and
images
how
s'est
the
organisée
trajectory of the images
avec
was
vraiment des
organized
éléments
in
très
order to
précis,
give
comment
the
ces
various
photographes ouest-africains,
precise
ils
item,
faisaient
how
eux-mêmes
the
des
Western
voyages, d'où ils
photographs
achetaient leur
were able to
matériel, comment
travel, they were
toute
able to
cette
buy their
culture visuelle,
material,
encore une fois, elle
how we
s'est
could have the
construite
visual
à
culture, how
partir
it was constructed
d'individualité.
from
Et on a pu
individualities. And
aussi
then we were able as well
revenir
to
sur quelques
come
cas
back on a
précis,
few
comme Anabelle l'a
precise
dit. On
cases,
a
like
dans le
Annabelle
livre
said so
des
within
textes
the
assez
book,
généraux, assez
with a
régionaux, et
very
puis
general
des cas de
text.
figure beaucoup plus
We've got
précis
a few
sur, par
specific
exemple,
cases on
une
which
ville.
we can
Et
talk, for
on a
example, a
pu demander
specific
à
town, we're
cette
able to
chercheuse
ask
américaine, Bukola Gabrissi,
within the American
qui a
book, for
travaillé sur
example,
Lagos, de faire
for the
un
one who
essai
was working in
spécifique sur
Lagos,
cette
to
ville
do a
de
specific
Lagos,
try on the
parce
Lagos
qu'il
town
il y a des cas
city,
très spécifiques
because there are
sur
very
lesquels c'est
specific
intéressant de se
cases on
pencher,
which it is
notamment
interesting
Lagos au
to
19e
see
siècle
them, because
a eu
Lagos
par moment un
in the
statut
19th century
spécifique
had a
où
specific
notamment il y avait des
status. For
conditions
example, namely, there were
économiques et
some
par exemple un accès
specific
à l'eau
economic
qui était beaucoup plus
condition. They had
intéressant
access
pour
to
des
water. It
photographes
was
qui
far more
utilisaient beaucoup l'eau
interesting
pour réaliser
for
les
the
épreuves,
local
laver, tout
photographers
ça.
because they needed water
Et
in
donc, il
order
y a
to
différentes
wash their
conditions comme
material,
ça
and they
qui ont
needed
fait
it to
que sur
develop
certains
photography. So
endroits, il y
that
a
is
eu une
why on
conjonction
some areas there was a
particulièrement
conjunction of
féconde et
different
particulièrement
condition,
intéressante qui a
which
fait
was very
qu'il y a eu
fecund,
beaucoup de
very
photographes
which
dans ces
provided a
endroits-là. Et
lot
Lagos,
of
c'est un très bon
opportunities
exemple de
for
ça.
photographies to be taken.
Donc,
So
par
there are quite
exemple,
a
le
few
cas
examples of
de
that. For
Holm,
example, the
c'est aussi
case of
un cas
Holmes
assez
as well, which
fascinant
is a very
d'un
fascinating
personnage qui
cases
était
of someone who was able
installé
to
au
um,
Nigeria,
to
et
be
puis
settled in
qui est
Nigeria and to come
parti
back,
en
and he was
Angleterre, qui est
part.
devenu
He
même
went back to
avocat, qui a
England
une
and
deuxième
he
vie
became a
avec une nouvelle
solicitor. He
profession,
had a second life on a new
et puis qui est
profession,
revenu
and then he
s'installer
was able to come back and
et a continué un
resettle.
commerce de
Later on, he
photographie,
was
notamment avec son fils et
able
avec la
to do a
diffusion
trade in the
de
art of
cartes postales.
photography with his
Donc, dans
son,
ces
namely
images-là,
postcards. So within these
j'en parle
various
aussi aujourd'hui
images,
parce
I'm
que
talking about
ça a été une
this as
acquisition
well because
importante
it
pour
was
nous,
an
mais c'est
acquisition
aussi
that
un
was very important
matériau
for
qu'on
us,
tient à promouvoir
and
pour
we
des
wanted
études faites là-dessus,
to promote new
pour que les
studies, of course,
étudiants,
in
les
order
jeunes
for the
chercheurs
students and
s'emparent de
for the
ce
young
matériel,
people to
et
be fully
puis
knowledgeable of this
réalisent à quel point il y
material.
a
And they were
vraiment
able
des
to come
gisements
to terms
entiers
to the
de
fact that there are
connaissances nouvelles
entire
à explorer.
sources of new knowledge to be explored.
Ici, il y a un autre aspect dont on parle à la fois dans l'exposition et et dans le livre. Dans le livre, on a pu bénéficier du concours de Céleste Haller, qui est une jeune chercheuse qui a terminé sa thèse il y a 2 ans ou 3 ans, enfin tout récemment, et qui avait travaillé sur la question du refus d'être photographiée. Et c'est vrai que quand j'avais vu sa thèse et assisté à la soutenance, j'avais été frappée par le fait que c'était vraiment, on avait là un
I was a
sujet
surprise
absolument
because
majeur,
there
une
was a
question
subject
fondamentale de la
and it was
photographie,
a major
qui est cette
fundamental
question
question in
du
this respect.
consentement ou
And
du
we had the
demi-consentement
question of
ou
the consent,
de la collaboration
and we were
qui peut se
able to
faire
talk
ou qui
about the
devrait se faire entre,
collaboration.
c'était pas
We
des
were
fois entre un
able to talk
photographe
about
et
the
la
different
personne
things
qui
between the
représente.
photographer and the people who were
Donc, Céleste
represented.
Allaire
So
gentiment
Celeste Allaire
accepté de participer à cet
gently
ouvrage.
accepted
Et
to
je pense
take
que c'est
part
vraiment
in the
une
work,
participation
and
extrêmement importante
it was a
pour le livre.
very
Elle
important
était
participation.
assez logique dans la
And it
mesure où
was
dans
a very
l'exposition
logical
elle-même,
thing
on avait
because
cet
within the
objet qui est le
exposition
dernier objet
we had the
présenté dans
last item that
l'exposition
was
et qui
presented
revenait
within the
justement sur cette
exhibition,
question
and that came back on the question
de la
of
non-autorisation donnée
non-authorization that was not given
d'une contrainte
regarding
implicite
the
organisée par le
implicit
photographe
constraint
pour
that was
obtenir cette fameuse image qu'il
done by
voulait
the photographer
avoir.
to get
Et
the
ici, on a
famous
un
picture that he
album
wanted to
sur
get.
lequel
And
je ne vais pas
here we've
m'attarder,
got an
sinon
album, and I'm
Diva
not going
n'aura
to
plus le
talk
temps,
too much about it
mais
because
qui
otherwise
parle
Diva is
de
not
cette
going to have
question
any time to talk
de la
about it. And we were
relation
talking about the question of the
et de la façon
relationship
dont là,
between
exactement entre ces deux
what
images,
was
le
there between the
photographe
two
qui écrit le
pictures, and the
commentaire en bas de
photographer that
l'image et
was
décrit
writing the
très
comment at
exactement
the
ce qu'il est
bottom
en
of the
train de faire,
pictures, and he's
explique dans la partie
stating
gauche de
exactly what
l'album
he's going to
qu'il est en
do
train
in
de
the left
discuter
part of
avec
the
ces
album, and he's
Indiens
talking
réunis devant
with
une
these
église
Indian
et que,
people
au lieu de leur dire j'aimerais bien
gathered
prendre en photo,
before a
il
church, and
organise
before
une
telling
espèce de
them, I'm
petite
going to
discussion
take a there's a little bit of a
distraire. À un moment,
discussion
il installe son
in order to
trépied, son
distract
appareil
them at the time
photographique
when he's
et
going to
puis il
set up
continue
his
à
tripod
parler
for
comme
the
ça, sans
photography
dire
and
qu'il est
to
en train de
carry
faire
on
une
talking
photo.
about
Et on voit
this
bien
and to
qu'il se passe
say that
quelque
he's
chose entre
going
les
to
2
do
images,
a
puisque dans la deuxième, les
photography,
gens sont
and we
levés
can
comme ça et le
see
regardent d'un air
that people
perplexe. Et lui explique
stood
très
up as a
clairement en
little
dessous
bit
de l'image
perplexed
que
about it, and he
ils se sont
explained
levés quand ils
effectively
ont
very
entendu le fameux
quickly
clic
that
et que
they
lui,
were when
à ce
they heard
moment-là,
the
a
bar
bien compris
click,
qu'il faisait quelque chose qui n'était pas très
effectively they
honnête
understood
et
that
qu'il
there
a
was
continué à le
something that
faire
was
parce
not
qu'il
very
voulait
honest,
absolument
so he
avoir cette
carried on
deuxième
doing
image
it
aussi.
because he wanted to have
Donc
the
c'était
second
là-dessus
picture. So
que
here,
l'exposition
of
se
course, we
terminait
can see the
pour permettre
exhibition
aux
on which it
visiteurs
was
de
ending
repartir
in
avec
order
cette
to
idée
see
de
the people, to see the
réfléchir
idea
cette question
of
très importante
what is
du
this very
rapport
important
dans la
question of
photographie
the
qui se construit
rapport
entre
between the
les
photography that
représentés
is
et
built on
les
the
photos.
subjects and the
Donc voilà, en
photographer.
gros,
So
ce
here
dont on
it
a
is
essayé de
a
parler.
cross
Mais
murder
maintenant, je
when
vais
we
passer
talk about it,
la
but now
parole
I'm going to
à
give the
Diva,
floor to
qui va
Diva.
rentrer un peu plus en
Diva who's going to go
profondeur sur
further
ce
into
sujet
details
autour de la
regarding the
photographie
topics
à
for
Bombay.
photography in Bombay, Mumbai.
Yes, it does. I was really excited to work on this project with Christine and Anabelle. It was a real pleasure for me. Despite being primarily a historian of Indian photography in the 20th century, I think something that has appealed to me is a question about how we place Indian photography, and that's really something that starts very much from its inception in the few months after the invention or the announcement of the invention in Paris in August 1839. Within those months, we already have announcements in Indian newspapers of the invention of photography. Within a few months of that, we have advertisements of imports of photographic equipment in places like Bombay and Calcutta. We have, after that, a rich, almost 2 centuries now of production of images, I think, that really are about reconciling Indianness or sort of Indian modes of vision, etc., with what the technology offers. But as a scholar of Indian photography, the most sort of standard response that I've had in academic settings is the idea that I'm not a scholar of photography, that photography is something that's produced in Euro-America, and that things like Indian photography or photography in Gabon or photography in the Middle East are what Christopher Penny referred to as ex-nominated, separated, hyphenated from the status of photography. I think what this siloing does of photography in the 19th century and the 20th century, very much ongoing, is it produces a framework, one that I think reproduces the logic of imperial center and periphery, where photography happens here and what happens in, say, a city like Bombay is localized, is separate, is hyphenated. But another thing that it can do is it can stop us, or it can withdraw us from being able to make very important connections across photography across the world. And so I think something that this exhibition and this book have really done, and something I really salute Christine and Anabelle for, is that they've been really fantastic at drawing out connections, not simply between the kind of colonial center and periphery that might exist in many of these photographs, the kind of imperial relationships that make these images, but also thinking about forms of localization across various places, what we call sometimes vernacular photography, and the way that there might be patterns across those, right? And I think what it allows us to do is to think about photography horizontally, to think about photography in a way that displaces some of these connections. So just on that note, I want to come back to this question of photography in Bombay in the 19th century. Within months, as I said earlier, there is already photographic equipment in Bombay, in places like Bombay and Calcutta. For those who don't know much about this, by this point, in the mid-19th century, Bombay and Calcutta, the vast parts of South Asia, are under the British Empire. There are changes in that authority structure, actually very importantly in the 1850s, where it goes from the colonial authority of the East India Company, which is a sort of commercial holding that runs an empire, to the British Crown. This is something that happens very much at the moment that our protagonists today are operating. But at the same time, it was these people, it was commercial, through commercial initiatives such as the East India Company, that cities such as Bombay that we're looking at today had developed into vast imperial hubs. These were important cities built out of fishing villages. They connected not simply various parts of the western coast of India, but also the Indian Ocean world. They attracted employment from all over. So suddenly Bombay goes from, over a few decades from being a kind of sleepy island, sort of woven together by the British, into becoming a vast, sophisticated, cosmopolitan hub of different languages, of different communities, of people coming in from across the Indian Ocean, of people coming in from the elites coming in from other parts of India. So I think it's really important to kind of place this idea of the colonial cosmopolitanism of Bombay in the forefront. We're not dealing with an imperial backwater, right? It's important to say we're dealing very much with a center of multilingual, multi-ethnic, multiracial mixing. This is also a place where photography very much starts to blossom. I think from the 1840s onwards, we have references to studios that were operating not simply of scholars, not simply photographers such as Narayan Daji and Hari Chand Chintaman, who I'll be looking at in a moment, but actually also looking at, we have advertisements for a C. Ayaswamy, who's supposed to have had a studio. We have a Parsi gentleman called Nasirvanji Ardasir. We have an active society of photography called the Photographic Society of Bombay. I think we're okay for now. And then also we have these vast imperial projects of photography that are really marking visual culture at this moment. The East India Company office in London was a small operation in the east of London in a street called Leadenhall Street. It no longer exists. But from that small office expanded this vast imperial vision of how to order and control through sight, through recognition, through ordering, the various communities and religions and racial groups that the East India Company found themselves controlling over the course of the 19th century. Photography, as Christopher Pinney has argued before, kind of extends the vision, the logic of measurement of the colonial people, something that had started with the census, for example, in places like India. And also the enclosing of this world, something that happens via the telegram, the railway, things like this. So we can see how photography belongs to a kind of enclosing and making familiar of this imperial space. It was important for the camera to be used as an instrument of empire. And so at this moment, we have many administrators who were involved in East India Company governance who were also trained in photography. William Johnson and one of his collaborators, William Henderson, were, for example, involved in the kind of machinery of British Raj in Bombay, but were also active photographers, active in the Photographic Society of Bombay. And this is sort of a series. This is just what you see on your slides here is a folio from the Indian Amateurs Photographic Album, which is a regular kind of photographic album that was being produced in Bombay at this moment. Again, trying to capture the kind of local communities that inhabited this space, the kind of areas that they belonged to. And what we find very interesting here is that although it starts very much through this logic of imperial vision, knowing who you are ruling over, knowing that who you are governing, and in some way fixing their identity through photographs, we also have Indians participating in some of this as well. And that's where some of this becomes quite interesting, and it's not as straightforwardly a case of a binary between imperial officers taking specific kinds of images and Indians taking other kinds of images. So maybe we can change the slide. So you see on your left here, Hari Chand Chintaman, who was one such Indian taking photographs in 1850s onwards. He was, unfortunately, we don't have a picture of Narayan Daji to my knowledge. I don't think one has been found. Maybe there is one, but Hari Chand Chintaman, Narayan Daji, Narayan Daji's brother, Bhau Daji. There's a generation of photographers active in Bombay in the 1850s, 1860s. Some of them had studied photography, like Harichand Chintaman at the Elephantstone College. Others were amateurs who had picked it up through the cycles of circulars and pamphlets that were being produced on photography and circulated across the world. They were active in the Photographic Society of Bombay. They were active in the production of these kinds of albums. And so again, we see the blurring of the lines between an imperial envisioning of India and the Indian agents who were often active in this kind of making. We also see through their studios, Harichand Chintaman had a studio of his own that I will come to in a minute. We see this way in which there's a domestication or a kind of localization of these camera practices to their own ends. So these men have very thriving photographic studios that all that a kind of rising middle class comes to in order to be photographed, in order to be shown as a kind of, as a form of social mobility to show that they're coming up in the world. In other cases, you have Indian Maharajas arriving to being sort of sending for them and asking them to be photographed. In other cases, as in the case of Maharaja Ram Singh II of Jaipur, who was actually a very prolific photographer, we have the case of members of the kind of ruling elite of India taking up photography themselves. So just to say, this is not by any way the kind of sort of, how shall I say, a monopoly of the British colonial eye or practice. It's very much a space in which we might envisage a kind of contact zone where Indians with some, and I must say, not all Indians, this is very much a kind of upper elite, upper caste, upper class, primarily male practice in India at this moment, adopting camera technologies to their own ends, for some professional ends, for some more about social mobility, and using them in very specific ways. So I just want to move forward for a second. I just showed you earlier the example of the Indian Amateurs photographic album, which was something that was produced in the 1850s, but something that we know that photographers such as Narayan Daji actually contributed to is another effort by William Johnson and William Henderson, which is called The Oriental Races and Tribes, Residents and Visitors of Bombay, an album that's produced in 2 volumes in 1863 and 1866. Interestingly, though, the volume itself, some of them, the initial images actually come out of the Indian Amateurs photographic album. So we have images in this album, some of which date back to the 1850s. And again, we have this very curious, I'm so confused, delighted by the form of printing that we see here. This is a form of printing called combination printing, where negatives of subjects who were supposed to be typical of their communities and supposed to have lived in Bombay were combined with negatives of the backgrounds that they're supposed to have inhabited. So you get a very kind of almost National Geographic style ordering of people into their ideal spaces through the fusion of negatives together in this form of combination printing. And these 2 volumes are extensively about ordering people, trying to show the various religious groups, try to in some way also identify the caste markings, the forms of dress and adornment that various communities would have had. You might say that some of this is very useful for an incoming officer of the East India Company. So if you were traveling from London to take up a new post in Bombay, something like an album like The Oriental Races of Tribes would have been very useful for you to understand the people who you're dealing with, to understand which community they belong to, which religious affiliation they belong to. So it was very much one of those combinations of imperial vision and thinking about being better administrators through photography, but also through this very fascinating technological revolution, right, of combination printing. Some of the work of Narayan Daji also features in this. So this is actually a really astounding, I think, print of the Vallabhacharya Maharajas, which is again a kind of subcaste and ethnic group that existed in Bombay at the time. And again, we have, the original negative is by Narayan Daji. So Narayan Daji was the one who would have taken the picture of the actual subjects, which were then put into a kind of combined printing process against the temple background. So we get this, again, really curious way in which people are identified vis-a-vis their markers, forms of dress, forms of adornment, but also their religious affiliations. In this case, going down to the temple specifically that they would have gone to, right? So it's very much a kind of encyclopedic project, I think, in Bombay that you might say someone like Narayan Daji has contributed to. If we go to the next slide, this is actually the original folio that you can see. So this is actually from the 1850s, I believe, and then it was taken up in the 1863 album in order to be made into a combination print. For anyone who's interested and happens to be in London, the folios remain intact at the British Library, and it's actually really a delight to go and see them, and I suggest that you do if this is of interest to you. But just to say again, this is a really curious concept to grapple with. These two Indian men, Narayan Daji and Hariyachand Chintaman, who are very much participating in the scopic vision of empire, participating in the idea that empires can be made through vision, can be made through ordering, and can be made through encyclopedic productions of these subjects. And I think this contact zone that they exist in, where they are elite Indian men and yet kind of participate in these projects, is itself very interesting, and I think points towards the ambiguity of empire at this point, the fact that there were always agents in the middle who function and operate between them, and also that their roles are not limited to imperial functioning, because they also have vast successful studios where they have many Indian clientele. One popular way that these images were made and circulated is obviously in the visiting card, the carte de visite. Please forgive my accent. But I think something that we really see now in scholarship on the 19th century in photography is the idea that we have to rid ourselves of thinking of it as another time that was much more distant, that was much more disconnected. And one of the reasons that we believe this is because this culture of visiting cards, the way that photography existed and circulated in many worlds past the worlds of the photographer, is, I think, a really important aspect of this. So this is a photo that was actually in the book as well. It's a visiting card of Narayan Daji, and it arrives, you would never guess this, but in the album of Prince Albert, who was obviously the consort of Queen Victoria. Albert was an avid collector of photography through these cartes de visites, and so we get these albums of possibly either his own handwriting, or more likely a handwriting of someone in his court, someone in his employ, who labels what would have been at the back sometimes of these cards to the front in order to be pasted in these albums. And something then again that really struck me about this was this question of how can we be thinking about the logic of colonial center and periphery when these images are very actively moving between the two? You know, these men are learning the kind of language of technology that's coming to them in places like Bombay. They're also readapting this technology. They're learning more about it. They're developing new techniques. They're participating in this kind of technology of the visiting card, and it's being sent right back out again. So I think it's important to see Bombay as one of a series of sites in which there's a communication through images. And it's really difficult, I think, when you see the life of this image, for example. So this, hopefully you can see, is the elephant. It's an elephant with its handler bringing in. It's being brought into the throne of Bhavnagar. So it was basically taken on the western coast of India. It was one of the royal elephants of a particular royal family. But it very much surpasses the space in which it was taken, and it has this very rich afterlife as a carte de visite that then travels eventually to Prince Albert himself. These are from the royal collection. And similarly here, again, we get another picture that was taken by Narayan Daji in the mid-19th century of Ahmedabad. So again, a city on the western front. It was a port city. It was sort of on a very active trading region. It was also a city at this time rich with cosmopolitanism, not to the extent of Bombay, but very much you have a number of kind of Gujratis or members of this community coming down to Bombay and participating there. Sometimes as colonial agents, sometimes as traders. So it's a very sort of strong trading city that you see Daji kind of coming to. And I think, again, the point is to say that Bombay photographers were never restricted to Bombay. They were often known far beyond their local remit. They were invited to other places. Sometimes they just went along themselves. Even in the Oriental races and tribes, some of the communities that are shown, some of the subjects may not have necessarily been residents or visitors of Bombay, but not necessarily residents of Bombay, but people who were traveling through. So again, just to say that these are how should I say, these are people who transcend the geographies to which we associate them, that they belong much more actively. The images are traveling everywhere, of course, and the photographers themselves are also traveling around a fair bit. You see more cards visits here, but studio photography here by Harichand Chintaman. Harichand Chintaman is a really fascinating example, I think, in some of this, because he's a photographer. He studies photography, as I said, at Elphinstone College. He's also a devout Hindu and sort of presides over a Hindu revivalist society in Bombay called the Bombay Arya Samaj. He's contributing and contacting all kinds of neo-spiritual groups that were coming to Bombay, such as the Theosophist Society that develops in England, this kind of Victorian spirituality movement that comes to India. So he's much more than the photographer that we see him as. He also is responsible for developing a text on photography. So he actually writes a book on photography, explaining new photographic techniques that he had developed, he had invented himself. I think, again, just important to reiterate here that it's not simply a case of invention moving from west to east. Lots of these actors and agents of photography in the East are finding for themselves new forms of invention, new forms of image development, and are sending them right back out there. We have proof of a photograph by Harichand Chintaman being shown in Paris in 1867. So yet again, another really fascinating example of these images transcending the logic of the periphery to which we often relegate them. I think generally what you see here, some of these images of Harichand Chintaman's is a way in which a new colonial middle class is trying to express itself photographically. It's using this new medium, and this is something we see all over the world. We certainly see it in Victorian England as well. People who could not at the time afford being painted in the way that, say, aristocratic elites might have been, could now go to their local studio on a Sunday with their whole family, wearing their best clothes and be photographed. And this is no different in a way in Bombay in, say, the 1860s or 70s than it is in London or Paris. You have this way in which the studio interior is a site of performance, a site of performing your modernity, because you now here you are in this spanking new form of kind of technological engagement, but also performing your social mobility. I can afford to have this photograph made. I can afford to have this photograph made by this fancy cosmopolitan photographer. I get to pose with really interesting furniture that I may not have in my home. And really, actually, there's a book waiting to be written about the furniture of photo studios, because the way that these tables and these vases of flowers are supposed to perform, at least in some of the Indian examples, a kind of Victorian interior. I think there might be more on the next slide. Exactly. So again, you get this very unlikely or very unexpected movement, particularly in the slide on the right, of two Rajput men. So clearly a kind of prominent members of their community, dressed in the kind of association that we have with their community, with the turban and the sword, etc., but arriving to sit in this Victorian studio space with a vase of flowers in the middle, looking very much as though they're about to play cards with the lady of the house. And so you get this very curious, I think, movement that people like Harichand Chintaman, that people like Narayan Daji facilitate through their studios. These amazing hybrid images where Indians who exist at this time somewhere like Bombay are able to take up the visual adornments of modernity, of westernization through photography and craft new identities for themselves. these are just some other examples, just to say that there were many active photo studios at this time in Western India. This is a portrait of a Parsi man by Clifton and Company in Bombay, which is you can see the kind of inscription on the verso of the card. So there would have been these really fantastic posters or at the backs of these photographs that photographic studios were using to advertise themselves. In some cases, you also have members of the kind of ruling elite inviting these photographers. So we have Raja Deen Dayal and Sons Studios, which is a very well-known studio in India in the late 19th century. And actually, unfortunately, you can't see what it says on the verso of his card, but basically it refers to a list of various royal patrons that Raja Deen Dayal had who had invited him to take their portrait. So it was also a matter of prestige for photographers to be able to say, well, I have 7 Maharajas on my client list. How many do you have? Right? So there's a way in which photography allows the photographer as well to transcend these new spaces, to have royal clients, to be these kind of authors or help the production of these images. So I just want to come back to this question of the 19th century and the making of photography in the 19th century. I think anyone who works on photography would agree that photographs don't just reflect a world that's out there, they actively remake the world, right? They actively act upon the world. These are not images that are pure reflections, these are performances. These are ways in which people could remake their identities. These are ways in which subjects of empire could take up a new technology and make it their own and send it back out. And it was a form for them of expressing some kind of social mobility in an increasingly hierarchical world that they belonged to. But something that has really always struck my work is, how do we think about the global when it exists through these frameworks of coercion, of imperial control, of people like Harichand Chintaman being very much the kind of, or the happier and more socially able end of a vast and controlling imperial network. How do we therefore think about global connections without resorting to a fetishization, I think, of the global, being able to be aware of the kind of coercion and the hegemony that this is forged of? I think people like Chintaman and Daji and Deen Dayal, the way that their clientele extends past an imperial relationship, offer us a way out sometimes, because they show us how the world was not simply about this the colonizer-colonized binary. Their clients could exist across the world. The ways that their images circulated was certainly past the associations that we now have with that world. But I think it's really just important to keep this in mind, to produce global histories of photography that at the same time are very conscious of the power relations that the global was dependent on, and to say that these actors had some stake and some ability to pronounce themselves modern and belonging to this modernity, but it was at the same time deeply colonial. And a huge kind of visual body of work emerges out of this, I think, in the 20th century, that in many ways develops this kind of vernacularization is another way out, another way to say there are ways in which this technology could offer people ways of self-expression that sometimes exceeds the expectations of that medium, and certainly the expectations of that medium that was set in places like Britain and France. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Diva. Pour finir aussi avec des questions et montrer la complexité de ces situations,
People, they have
de ce
questions,
contexte.
and
Et c'est
to
vraiment
show the
le but
complexity
aussi
of the
de
situation,
l'ouvrage, d'ouvrir, de poser des questions et
it's also the
d'ouvrir
objective of the
aussi de
book
nouvelles
to
perspectives
open up new
de
perspectives,
recherche.
and
C'est un ouvrage de
also for
400
research.
pages, mais c'est
It's a
évidemment
book of 400
aussi
pages,
un début
but it's also a
d'autres
beginning
histoires
for
possibles
other
et
possible
d'autres voilà,
stories
doivent aussi générer
which also
d'autres
must
choses. Et
generate
on a aussi,
other
juste pour
things
conclure, tenu
for the future. And just to
colloque
conclude, we
de 2
had
jours, les 15 et 16 juin, qui était aussi un moment
a
très
meeting
important
on the
et encore
15th
un
and 16th
nouveau
June,
prolongement de
which is
l'exposition,
also
d'ouvrage le
a new
colloque est un moment
continuity,
particulièrement important
a
aussi
colloquium
de
that
rencontres
was an important
de
moment
nombreux
to
auteurs de l'ouvrage
meet
et
different
d'autres intervenants
authors of the book
et pour
and
faire
other
aussi
speakers to be
connecter
able to
ces récits et
connect
l'éveil
those
de la
stories and
question.
make
Voilà,
emerge new
merci beaucoup
questions. Thanks a
de
lot.
nous avoir écoutés. Je crois
Thanks a lot
qu'on n'a
for
pas le temps.
having listened to us. I think we do not
Pas
have
sûr
the
qu'on ait le
time
temps
to, not
pour
sure
des
we have the
questions,
time
mais on est à votre
for
disposition
questions, but we are
si vous
always
souhaitez
available if
pour en
you want
discuter.
to talk to us.
Merci beaucoup.
So, thank you.